Okay, guys, I'm Sharun Mukand, theme leader for Research 2. So this is the Dog Day session, 4:40, and you can see why. It's on culture and policy making. And I hope to disabuse you as to, so though this is theme 2, I noticed that this is the organizers in their wisdom have put this last. And the reason is, at some level, culture and policy making often are thought not to go together. Economic principles are often considered universal. Well, if economic principles are universal, why is it the case that reforms that succeed in one setting often perform poorly or completely fail in other contexts, right? So that's, in a sense, the question that we've been examining in the development theme over here. And in first case, we looked at the role of institutions, and second case, we've been looking at the role of culture. And the idea over here is what we wanted to push against was the notion that, yes, one possible reason as to why this may occur is culture, but we didn't want to go as far as the cultural determinists would have us go, which is people like Gregory Clark or David Landis, who would argue that if we learn anything from the history of economic development, it is that culture makes all the difference. What counts is work, thrift, honesty, and patience, all of which is true, but it isn't very helpful for policy making. So if Sasha is hardworking and productive, which we know he is, it's not just because he's a Protestant. I happen to have some Protestant relatives in India, and trust me, even after they became Protestant, they're still bone lazy. So the general point I wanted to push against was this cultural determinism, which often has inflicted some policy making because it suggests that culture cannot be changed, or even policy making in a cultural environment is difficult to imagine. And culture cannot be changed because either it moves too slowly, because often, as in the case of the book by Huntington and Harrison, the implication is quite conservative because it suggests that, well, policy making is likely to be ineffective. And the reason why I wanted to push against this was, well, we know that this is not always the case. Two-track reform may work well in Deng's China, but not in Gorbachev's Soviet Union. Gradualism may be appropriate to India, but not Chile. Women's empowerment programs in India may yield very positive results in the state of West Bengal, less so in Kerala, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So the point that I wanted to suggest over here was specificity of culture, specificity of institutions, specificity arising because of historical context are important to understand success or failure. Local context is important. So over here at CAGE, we've tried to study the role of culture in the development process at two levels. One is at the micro level, where we have done, precisely because local cultural context is important, we wanted to emphasize, and we've engaged in lots of studies which engage in experimentation and applied micro studies at the village, firm, and organizational levels, especially at the firm level, and Amrita will talk much more about this. And we've also talked about and studied culture at the macro level, right? So the questions which have animated us over here is, can policy change culture in the short, medium run? Right? So everybody knows that, well, given long enough time, culture may change, values may change. But in the short, medium run, can things change, especially at the macro level? That's precisely where you would expect things to be difficult. Second, I wanted to point out, that culturally mediated policy interventions have the potential to be more effective, right? So what did I have in mind over here? So part of what we had in mind, and in Mukand and Warwick, we develop a conceptual framework to think about it, is that policymakers can often do exploit the cultural context, and they deploy memes to market and sell their policies, right? And the meme can be any combination of behavioral, cultural cues, narratives, symbols, which can be used to communicate to the populace in a way such that attitudes change, right? And you can have memes about policy, you can have memes about identity. And what do I mean by that? So policy meme, an example would be Angela Merkel. For example, in 2008, she said, well, the roots of the crisis, this is the financial crisis, is quite simple. One should simply have asked a Swabian housewife. Okay, I never heard of Swabia before this. She would have provided us with a short, simple, and entirely correct piece of life wisdom, that we cannot live beyond our means. That is the core of the crisis, right? And for some reason, this resonated with Germans. But this message resonates with everybody. And part of the reason is not just the cultural context of the Swabian housewife, where Swabia apparently, I looked it up, is a region in southwestern Germany where the housewife is supposed to be prudent with the household money, but also at a psychological level, because as mentioned by Lord Skidelsky, formerly of Warwick, that people often think of government's finances very much as they think of their own household's finances. So every household knows that it has to balance its own books. So when somebody comes and says, well, austerity makes sense at the macro level, they also think that also is sensible, right? So you can have a culturally mediated communication at the policy level which can change attitudes. Similarly, you've had memes which have been used to change people's beliefs on the identity dimension. So this is William Wilberforce and the abolitionist movement, which originated in Britain. And part of what, as you can see from this poster, is that the person is trying to communicate, am I not a man and a brother, right? So the idea of, so trying to point out the humanity, essential, intrinsic in all people, is a way of getting your message. So this, in a curious way, resonates even with Shakespeare and Shylock. You remember that, you prick me in the needle, I not bleed. So that is context of Jews and Christians. I mean, over here you can see another context in which that same metaphor is being used to market, right? Similarly, women's suffrage, another way in which culturally mediated communication can change people's beliefs. So over here it says, what a woman may be and yet not have the vote. When talking about women's suffrage, mayor, nurse, mother, doctor, or teacher, or factory hand, and what a man may have been and yet not lose the vote. Convict, lunatic, proprietor of white slaves, unfit for service, and of course drunkard, right? So the point over here is these memes exist, they help communication, they change beliefs, and importantly, and that's what I would like to illustrate to you, they can also change culture, right? So here is a study by Arthur Bluin and myself, which would not have been funded because the regular funders would never do it, given the sensitivity of the material, but Cage did it. And that was on the Rwandan genocide, right? So 1 million people were killed, 70% Tutsi. And the question was, in this particular context, the question was, have things changed? So if you read the media, what you came across was that Kagame certainly was saying that things have changed. We're trying to have a new Rwandan identity. You cannot ask people and talk people about the Hutu-Tutsi identity. And going in, we were extremely skeptical because we said, okay, this guy is another African strongman, autocrat, and he's just trying to shake down international investors and foreign aid agencies, right? So we went into the field hoping to disprove this, but micro-studies are micro-studies. So what we did was so ostensibly, Kagame had undertaken a number of policy measures, right? Importantly, from our empirical purposes, one of the measures which he undertook was tight control of the radio. And over Radio Rwanda, there was a marketing of new Rwandan identity, reconciliation, marketing of soap operas, etc. And of course, you would say, well, there's been a genocide over here, damn it. How can you expect a soap opera which emphasizes reconciliation to ever work in this context, right? So the way we pinned things down was, well, Rwanda literally means land of 1,000 hills. And you have 27 radio transmission towers, so some places receive these Radio Rwanda transmission. Some parts of the mountain receive Radio Rwanda transmission and others don't, right? So if you are a village located in the green part, you receive Radio Rwanda transmission. If you're a village located in the red part, you do not. So we compared beliefs, behavior, trust levels, all at the interethnic level of people living in villages which received this soap operas, national identity, propaganda, new Rwandan identity, living on one part of Rwanda versus people living on the other side of the mountain. One part of the mountain which received radio broadcasts versus people in the other. And what we found was quite striking. Not only were interethnic trust levels higher, okay, we ran a series of experiments. Interethnic trust levels were higher. People in those villages who were located on that side of the mountain which was exposed to radio propaganda, they were, well, trust levels were higher. They were more likely to hang out with people of the other community. And most striking to us, their subconscious categorization of people of the other ethnicity was much less likely to be on the ethnic basis, right? So, for example, I've seen enough Rwandans by now that I can immediately make out who's Hutu and Tutsi. So Tutsi is, well, the second individual with and the second and the third individual are Tutsi, and the other two are Hutu. And Tutsis have more Nilo-Saharan markers, while Hutus have more are more Bantu. So they have, of course, there's been intermarriage and there's considerable overlap. But we do a simple recall task where we find that if you are located on the side of the mountain which is exposed to radio propaganda, you're more likely to confuse Hutus for Tutsis and vice versa. Okay? The other side, you never make that mistake. Okay? So the point is, so the reason why this is striking is 8 years of listening to propaganda, being exposed to radio was enough to change culture in an extremely hostile environment. Desperately poor country, of course, high state capacity, but desperately poor country where there has been a genocide, one of the worst genocides in recorded history, and just 8 years of this can change cultural attitudes. So my general point is culture is malleable and it can change even in the short run. It can overcome a history of conflict. So the point is culture matters, right? And what in subsequent studies we've seen, Arthur Bluin has carried out again with Cage Money, is that growth and productivity is among coffee farmers in these regions is also higher, and so on. Now, of course, as one says that culturally mediated messages matter, as well as culture is malleable, two of the essential requirements for policymaking. I should also emphasize the downside, because this emphasizes that economists will remain in business. Why? Because with culture in the mix, lessons are not easy to generalize. We would ordinarily, what would we like to say? Well, if a particular policy works in region X, it's likely to work in region Y. And our answer is not so, right? So it calls for greater modesty by policymakers and for their policy recommendations. Now, over to Amrita. Thanks very much.